A transport vessel bound for the galactic core was nearly full, its seats occupied by a mix of diplomats, merchants, and officials from various worlds. The atmosphere was one of casual conversation, quiet murmurs blending with the hum of the ship's engines as it prepared for takeoff. Among the passengers was a lone human soldier, clad in a worn but well-maintained uniform, the insignia of Earth's military still visible on his shoulder. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his face bearing the lines of experience, his posture straight despite the weight of a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. As he approached the seating area, he found no place available. The rows were filled with passengers who barely glanced at him before returning to their conversations. He turned to a nearby steward, a robotic attendant programmed to assist travelers, and inquired about an open seat. The response was curt. All seats had been claimed. No exceptions. A murmur spread through the passengers, some stealing glances in his direction. He was an anomaly here, a soldier among civilians, a remnant of a war they preferred to forget. The war between humanity and the Galactic Coalition had ended years ago, but its scars remained. Some still viewed humans with suspicion, considering them violent, unpredictable, even dangerous. Others simply dismissed them as a species that had no place in the greater order of the galaxy. The soldier exhaled, shifting his bag slightly as he considered his next move. Standing for the duration of the journey was not an option, nor was waiting for another transport. He had orders, a duty to fulfill. He stepped forward once more, this time addressing a high-ranking official seated comfortably near the front. The official barely acknowledged him, his gaze fixed on a data pad. "I just need one seat," the soldier stated. His voice was calm but firm. The official sighed, setting down his device. "I'm afraid that's not possible. You should have arranged proper accommodations in advance." A few passengers snickered. The soldier could hear them whispering. He recognized the tone. Dismissal. Contempt. A younger officer seated nearby, adorned in the crisp uniform of the Galactic Coalition's peacekeeping force, smirked. "Maybe you should have thought of that before showing up uninvited." The words stung, not because of their cruelty, but because they echoed a sentiment that had become all too common. Humanity was tolerated but not welcomed. Even after proving themselves in battle, after making sacrifices that no one could deny, they were still outsiders in the grand scheme of the galaxy. For a moment, the soldier considered his options. He could protest, demand fair treatment, but what would that accomplish? He had seen enough of bureaucracy to know how this would end. He had been denied things before: respect, recognition, a place among those he had once called allies. This was just another instance in a long line of rejections. Then, the voice of a child cut through the murmur. "Why can't he sit?" The room fell silent. A young girl, no older than 8 or 9, sat beside her mother, her large, inquisitive eyes fixed on the soldier. The mother looked embarrassed, shifting uncomfortably as whispers spread once more. "It's complicated, dear," the mother murmured. The girl frowned. "But why?" The soldier said nothing. He didn't need to. The question lingered in the air, exposing an unspoken truth. It wasn't about seating arrangements. It was about perception, about prejudice wrapped in protocol, about wounds that had never truly healed. An elderly man sitting near the back cleared his throat. He had been silent throughout the exchange, observing with a quiet intensity. Now, he rose slowly. His aged frame moving with deliberate care. "This man fought for us," the old man said. His voice, though weathered, carried a weight that demanded attention. "While we sat in our homes, safe and untouched, he stood on the front lines. While we debated policies and treaties, he bled for our survival. And now, we refuse to offer him a seat." His words hung in the air like a challenge. The passengers shifted uncomfortably. The young officer who had mocked the soldier looked away, his smirk gone. The high-ranking official at the front adjusted his collar, suddenly interested in the floor. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken guilt. Then, without a word, the elderly man stepped aside and gestured to his own seat. The soldier hesitated. "Please," the old man insisted. "Sit." Before the soldier could respond, another passenger stood up. A woman this time, dressed in diplomatic attire. She motioned toward her seat as well. One by one, others followed, until nearly half the cabin had offered him a place. The steward, previously indifferent, now seemed uncertain, its mechanical processors struggling to reconcile the sudden shift in social dynamics. The soldier surveyed the faces around him. Some were ashamed, others quietly defiant, but the old man's words had struck something deeper. A realization, long overdue. Finally, he nodded in gratitude and took a seat. The child smiled. The transport lifted off, carrying its passengers toward their destination. But something had changed. For the first time in a long while, the soldier felt seen, not as an outsider, not as a remnant of a war long past, but as something more. 1. A human soldier is denied a seat on a transport vessel due to lingering prejudice against humanity after a past war. 2. Passengers dismiss and mock him, reinforcing the perception that humans are unwelcome in the galactic order. 3. A child questions the unfairness, breaking the silence and forcing the passengers to confront their bias. 4. An elderly man stands up, reminding everyone of the soldier's sacrifices and the injustice of his treatment. 5. One by one, passengers offer their seats, marking a quiet but powerful shift in perspective. The transport vessel hummed with the quiet conversations of its passengers, a diverse mix of species from across the galaxy. Some were diplomats, others merchants, traders, and officials, all on their way to the galactic core for various reasons. The atmosphere was one of routine travel, with most passengers either engaged in discussion, reviewing data pads, or gazing out of the large observation windows that framed the endless stretch of space beyond. The ship itself was a sleek model, designed for comfort rather than combat, a testament to the supposed unity of the Galactic Coalition. A lone human soldier stood near the entrance to the main seating area, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag as he surveyed the room. His uniform, though clean and well-maintained, bore the creases of long journeys and hard service. The insignia of Earth's military was still visible on his shoulder, a stark contrast to the refined attire of the civilian passengers around him. He walked forward with quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the rows of seats for an available space. As he moved through the aisle, he quickly realized that every seat was taken. Some passengers barely acknowledged his presence, while others glanced at him before turning away, their conversations resuming as if he were not there. He approached a nearby steward, a sleek robotic attendant programmed to handle passenger accommodations, and asked if there was an available seat. The steward's mechanical voice responded promptly. "All seats have been claimed. No exceptions allowed." The soldier remained silent for a moment, studying the passengers. The response did not entirely surprise him, though he had hoped for a different outcome. This was not the first time he had been treated as an afterthought, as something less than those around him. Humanity's place in the Galactic Coalition had always been precarious. Though the war had ended years ago, the scars remained, and many species still viewed humans with suspicion, if not outright disdain. A murmur spread through the cabin, subtle but unmistakable. The presence of a human soldier among them had not gone unnoticed. He could hear snippets of hushed conversations, words laced with amusement or irritation. Shouldn't he be on a military vessel? One voice whispered. I didn't know they let humans on these transports, another murmured. You'd think they'd learn to stay in their place. The soldier inhaled slowly, exhaling through his nose as he considered his options. There was no alternate transport scheduled for hours. Standing for the duration of the journey was not feasible, nor was turning back. He had a duty to fulfill, orders to carry out. Steeling himself, he stepped forward once more and addressed a high-ranking official seated near the front. The man was dressed in the pristine uniform of the Galactic Coalition's diplomatic corps, a symbol of status and authority. Sir, I require a seat, the soldier stated, his voice calm but firm. The official barely looked up from his data pad. All seats have been assigned. You should have arranged proper accommodations in advance. The dismissal was effortless, practiced, the kind of response given without a second thought. The soldier knew the words for what they were. A justification, an excuse to avoid any further discussion. A younger officer seated nearby chuckled, his own uniform marking him as a member of the coalition's peacekeeping force. Maybe you should have planned better, he said, smirking. Or maybe military types don't think that far ahead. The soldier met his gaze but said nothing. The response wasn't worth the effort. He had seen this expression before, the subtle amusement of someone who believed themselves superior, who saw him as little more than a relic from a war that no longer mattered. To them, he was not an equal. He was a reminder of an inconvenient past. As he turned away, considering his next move, a small voice cut through the murmur of conversation. Why can't he sit? The room fell silent. The words had come from a child, no older than 8 or 9, seated beside her mother. Her large, inquisitive eyes were fixed on the soldier, confusion written across her face. The mother looked embarrassed, shifting uncomfortably as she tried to quiet her daughter. "It's complicated, dear. But why?" the child insisted, her gaze unwavering. The soldier remained still, waiting. The question lingered in the air, demanding an answer. It was the kind of question that could not be dismissed as easily as an adult's protest. It exposed an unspoken truth, one that had been left to fester beneath layers of protocol and prejudice. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The young officer who had mocked him looked away, his smirk faltering. The high-ranking official adjusted his collar, suddenly more interested in his data pad than the conversation. Near the back of the cabin, an elderly man slowly rose from his seat. He had been silent throughout the exchange, his gaze thoughtful as he observed the unfolding events. Now, he took a step forward, his voice steady despite its age. "This man fought for us," the old man said, addressing the room rather than just the child. "While we sat in safety, he stood on the front lines. While we debated policies, he bled for our survival. And now, we refuse to offer him a seat." The weight of his words settled over the passengers like a heavy cloak. The steward, previously indifferent, hesitated as if recalibrating its protocols in response to the shift in social dynamics. The soldier said nothing, but his eyes met the old man's in quiet acknowledgement. Then, without a word, the elderly man stepped aside and gestured to his own seat. Before the soldier could respond, another passenger stood up. A woman in diplomatic attire. She motioned toward her seat as well. One by one, others followed, offering their places in an unspoken acknowledgement of what had transpired. The room, once filled with quiet murmurs of dismissal, had changed. The soldier surveyed the faces around him, some ashamed, others quietly contemplative. The old man's words had struck something deeper, something that could no longer be ignored. As the child watched with wide eyes, the soldier nodded in gratitude and finally took a seat. The transport continued on its course, carrying its passengers toward their destination, but something had shifted, something unspoken yet undeniable. The murmurs in the transport cabin had not died down entirely. The human soldier, standing at the front of the seating area, remained where he was, his expression unreadable. The stares directed his way varied, some were filled with curiosity, others with disdain. A few passengers merely observed, their silence revealing an unease they refused to voice. The weight of unspoken judgment pressed down on him, though he had long grown accustomed to such moments. The war had ended, but humanity's place in the galaxy remained uncertain. He had seen the suspicion in the eyes of those who called themselves allies, had felt the cold indifference of policies that spoke of unity but carried undertones of exclusion. The transport vessel's robotic steward had made its statement clear. All seats were taken, no exceptions. It was a simple, programmed response, one that carried no malice of its own but was reinforced by the passengers who did not question it. The soldier knew he could argue, knew he could demand that protocol be reconsidered, but what would be the point? He had faced rejection before, had been forced to swallow his pride more times than he could count. His duty had been to serve, and for that, he had endured hardships that few in this room could comprehend. And yet, here he stood, denied something as basic as a place to sit. He shifted his weight slightly, gripping the strap of his duffel bag, scanning the room once more. The seats were filled, but not entirely by necessity. Some passengers had arranged their belongings to take up extra space. Others sat beside empty seats, making no effort to offer them. A silent choice. A quiet statement. He did not belong here. Not among them. His gaze fell upon a high-ranking official seated near the front, a figure adorned in the pristine attire of the Galactic Coalition's diplomatic corps. This was a man who had likely never set foot on a battlefield, whose struggles had been fought across negotiation tables rather than trenches. The soldier stepped forward, addressing him directly. "I require a seat," he said, his voice steady but firm. The official barely glanced at him before returning to his data pad. "All seats have been assigned. You should have arranged proper accommodations beforehand." Dismissal. Effortless, practiced. The soldier's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression remained neutral. He had no expectation of kindness, nor did he seek it. But he had hoped, at the very least, for basic fairness. A younger officer seated nearby snorted softly. He was dressed in the uniform of the coalition's peacekeeping force, an organization that had been tasked with maintaining order after the war. Unlike the soldier, this officer had likely never fought on the front lines. And yet, there was an arrogance in the way he carried himself, as if he believed he had earned the right to look down upon a man who had. "You should have planned ahead," the officer remarked, smirking slightly. "Or is foresight not a strength of yours?" The words were meant to provoke, to elicit a reaction. The soldier gave none. He had faced worse, endured worse. The battlefield had hardened him, tempered his emotions into something controlled, measured. He had no desire to engage in pointless arguments with those who had no understanding of the sacrifices that had been made. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Some found amusement in the exchange, others turned away, uninterested in the unfolding scene. Few, if any, seemed inclined to intervene. It was easier to ignore, easier to pretend that none of this concerned them. The soldier had seen this before, had witnessed how people distanced themselves from discomfort, how they averted their eyes rather than confront injustice. Then, a voice cut through the quiet. A child's voice. "Why can't he sit?" The question was simple, innocent. But in that moment, it carried more weight than anything else that had been said. The child, seated beside her mother, looked around the room with wide, curious eyes. She was too young to understand the complexities of politics, too young to comprehend the unspoken rules that dictated who was welcome and who was not. To her, the situation made no sense. The mother shifted uneasily, glancing around as if hoping someone else would answer. "It's complicated, dear. But why?" The child pressed. "If there's space, why can't he sit?" The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. The passengers who had been whispering among themselves now hesitated, their words dying in their throats. The young officer who had mocked the soldier suddenly found his gaze fixed on the floor. Even the high-ranking official seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Near the back of the cabin, an elderly man stirred. He had been silent throughout the exchange, observing rather than participating. Now, slowly, he rose to his feet. His movements were deliberate, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "This man fought for us," the old man said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "While we were safe in our homes, he stood on the front lines. While we debated policies and treaties, he put his life on the line for the future of this galaxy. And now, we refuse to offer him a seat." His words settled over the room like a heavy weight. The air shifted, the unspoken prejudices laid bare in a way that could no longer be ignored. The passengers who had been quick to dismiss the soldier now found themselves faced with an uncomfortable truth. The robotic steward, which had previously been unwavering in its statement, hesitated as if uncertain how to process the change in atmosphere. It had followed its programming, followed the orders it had been given, but now it faced something that was not so easily categorized. A shift in social dynamics, an alteration in what was deemed acceptable. Then, without hesitation, the elderly man stepped aside and gestured to his own seat. The soldier met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. Before he could respond, another passenger stood. A woman this time, dressed in diplomatic attire. She motioned toward her seat as well. One by one, others followed, until nearly half the cabin had offered him a place. The child watched with wide eyes, her small hands gripping the edge of her seat as she took in the moment. The simple question she had asked had changed everything. The soldier looked around, seeing the shift not just in actions, but in expressions. Some passengers appeared ashamed, others contemplative, but none could deny what had just transpired. The murmurs had ceased. The atmosphere had changed. And for the first time in a long while, the soldier felt something he had not expected: acknowledgement. The transport vessel moved steadily through the void, its engines humming softly beneath the floor. Within the cabin, the atmosphere was calm, passengers seated in rows, engaged in quiet conversations or focused on their data pads. The ship was designed for comfort, a civilian vessel meant to ferry diplomats, officials, and travelers between the central worlds of the Galactic Coalition. It was not the kind of place one would expect tension, yet there was an unspoken weight in the air, a silent judgment that had settled over the room the moment the human soldier had stepped inside. He stood near the entrance, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag, his gaze sweeping across the passengers. His uniform was worn but well maintained, the insignia of Earth's military clearly visible on his sleeve. He had walked these halls before, had sat in similar rooms filled with people who refused to meet his gaze. The war was over, but its scars lingered in the minds of many. Humanity had fought for its place in the galactic order, and though they had proven their worth on the battlefield, acceptance was another matter entirely. He stepped forward, scanning the rows of seats. Every one of them was occupied, though not all by necessity. Some passengers had placed their belongings on empty seats, a silent deterrent, a quiet way of making their message clear. Others sat stiffly, pretending not to notice him as he moved down the aisle. He approached a robotic steward stationed near the front, its sleek metallic frame reflecting the ambient cabin lights. "All seats have been assigned," the steward stated in a mechanical tone. "No exceptions allowed." The words were simple, neutral, devoid of malice, but they were reinforced by the silence of the passengers, by the way no one spoke up, by the way no one so much as shifted to make space. The soldier remained still, considering his options. He had faced greater obstacles than this, had endured worse indignities, but the quiet exclusion still gnawed at him in a way that was difficult to ignore. He turned his attention to a man seated near the front, his uniform marking him as a high-ranking coalition official. If anyone had the authority to override protocol, it was him. "Sir, I require a seat." The official barely glanced up from his data pad. "All seats have been claimed. You should have made arrangements in advance." Dismissal, effortless and practiced. The soldier's expression remained neutral, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing against him. This was not about rules or logistics. It was something deeper, something unspoken. Humanity had fought alongside these very people, had bled for the survival of the coalition, and yet here he stood, unwelcome among those he had once defended. A younger officer seated nearby let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Maybe you should have planned ahead," he remarked, his tone laced with amusement. "Or is that not a skill they teach in human military training?" The insult was thinly veiled, but the soldier gave no reaction. He had faced worse. He had endured the kind of hatred that came not from words but from actions, from battles fought in trenches where the enemy did not see him as a man but as a threat to be eliminated. And yet, this moment felt heavier than he expected. The war had been against an external enemy, but the battle for acceptance was proving to be far more insidious. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Some found amusement in the exchange, others turned away, unwilling to acknowledge the scene unfolding before them. Few, if any, seemed inclined to intervene. It was easier to remain silent, easier to let things play out as they always had. The soldier was on his own. Then, a voice cut through the quiet. "Why can't he sit?" It was a child's voice, clear and innocent, unburdened by the weight of history or prejudice. Seated beside her mother, she looked around the room with wide, questioning eyes. She did not understand the politics at play, did not comprehend the layers of bias woven into the fabric of the galaxy's perception of humanity. To her, the situation was simple. The mother shifted uneasily, glancing at the other passengers. "It's complicated, dear. But why?" The child pressed, her gaze flickering between the soldier and the empty seats scattered throughout the room. "If there's space, why can't he sit?" The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The passengers who had been whispering moments ago now hesitated, their words dying before they could be spoken. The young officer who had mocked the soldier suddenly found his gaze fixed on the floor, his earlier smugness absent. Even the high-ranking official seemed momentarily caught off guard, as if the question had pierced through something deeper than he cared to admit. Near the back of the cabin, an elderly man slowly rose from his seat. He had been silent until now, content to observe rather than participate. But something in the child's question had stirred him. He took a step forward, his voice steady despite his age. "This man fought for us," the old man said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "While we were safe in our homes, he stood on the front lines. While we debated policies, he bled for our survival. And now, we refuse to offer him a seat." His words settled over the passengers like a heavy weight, undeniable and unyielding. The unspoken prejudices that had dictated their behavior were laid bare in that moment, exposed in a way that could no longer be ignored. The robotic steward, previously unmoving, hesitated as if recalibrating its protocols in response to the shifting social dynamics. The soldier remained silent, his expression unreadable, but in his eyes was an understanding, This was a moment that mattered, a moment that might not erase the past but could shape the future. Then, without hesitation, the elderly man stepped aside and gestured toward his own seat. Before the soldier could respond, another passenger stood. A woman in diplomatic attire. She motioned toward her seat as well. One by one, others followed, offering their places in an unspoken acknowledgement of what had transpired. The atmosphere in the room had changed. The child watched with wide eyes, her small hands gripping the edge of her seat as she took in the moment. The soldier glanced at her briefly before turning his attention back to the passengers around him. There was something different now, something subtle but significant. For the first time in a long while, the weight pressing down on him felt just a little lighter. The transport vessel continued its smooth journey through the void, its interior filled with the quiet hum of machinery and the low murmurs of conversation. The seats were occupied by diplomats, traders, and officials, each absorbed in their own business. The air was crisp and controlled, the lighting soft, the ambiance designed for comfort. It was a space meant for the privileged, for those who had secured their place within the galactic coalition, a place where the chaos of war was nothing more than a distant memory. Yet, within this atmosphere of quiet order, there was an undeniable tension that had settled over the room. The human soldier stood near the entrance, his presence a stark contrast to the carefully maintained civility around him. His uniform, though neat, carried the marks of wear. His posture was rigid, disciplined, but beneath the surface was an unmistakable exhaustion. He had seen battles that most in this room could only read about, had stood against enemies that had threatened to erase humanity from existence. And yet, here he was, standing before those he had fought to protect, denied something as simple as a place to sit. He stepped forward, eyes scanning the room, searching for an open seat. There were plenty. Some were occupied by bags or coats, others by passengers who sat deliberately in a way that signaled their refusal to share space. The silent rejection was not new. He had encountered it in many forms, in different places, from different people. The war had ended, but some wounds did not heal easily, especially those inflicted by prejudice. He approached the robotic steward, its gleaming frame reflecting the dim light of the cabin. Its programming was efficient, impartial, but not immune to the biases of those who had designed it. All seats have been assigned, the steward stated. No exceptions allowed. The words echoed through the room, reinforcing the unspoken message. He was not welcome here. The soldier said nothing for a moment, considering his options. He had endured far worse than this. A denied seat was nothing compared to the horrors he had faced on the battlefield, to the sacrifices he had made. But it was not about the seat. It was about something deeper, something that clung to him like a shadow. His gaze landed on a coalition official seated near the front, a man whose uniform bore the insignia of diplomatic authority. If anyone had the ability to intervene, it was him. "Sir, I require a seat," the soldier said, his voice calm but firm. The official barely looked up from his data pad. "Seats are assigned. If you failed to make arrangements, that is your own responsibility." Dismissed. Just like that. The soldier's jaw tightened slightly, but he showed no outward reaction. He had not expected anything different. The war had earned humanity its place among the stars, but not its acceptance. That, it seemed, would be a battle of its own. A quiet chuckle came from a nearby passenger, a young officer in the uniform of the coalition peacekeeping force. His expression was one of amusement, his posture relaxed in a way that spoke of privilege and confidence. "You should have planned ahead," the young officer remarked. "Or is that not a skill your kind excels at?" It was meant to provoke, to elicit a reaction. But the soldier had learned long ago the value of silence. Words were easy to throw, easy to weaponize. He had faced enemies that did not speak, did not taunt, only killed. The weight of experience kept him still, kept him from engaging in pointless conflict. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Some whispered among themselves, others simply observed, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. None offered assistance. It was easier to watch, easier to pretend this was not their concern. Indifference was always the simplest choice. Then, a voice rang out, clear and unafraid. "Why can't he sit?" It was a child. Small, curious, unburdened by the weight of history. Seated beside her mother, she looked around the room, confusion written across her face. To her, this moment made no sense. The rules of the world had not yet shaped her perceptions, had not yet taught her to ignore injustice. The mother hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It's complicated," she said gently, hoping to move past the moment. "But why?" The child persisted. "If there's space, why can't he sit?" Silence followed. The room, once filled with quiet conversations and idle distractions, was now heavy with something unspoken. The passengers who had ignored the soldier now found themselves unable to ignore the child's question. It was simple, yet it carried weight, a truth that could not be reasoned away. Near the back of the cabin, an elderly man stood. He had remained quiet until now, but something in the child's words had stirred him. His gaze swept across the room before settling on the soldier. "This man fought for us," the old man said, his voice steady. "While we debated policies, he bled for our survival. And now, we refuse to offer him a seat." The words struck like a hammer, shattering the fragile illusion of normalcy. The unspoken prejudices that had dictated the room's silence were now exposed, impossible to ignore. The young officer who had mocked the soldier looked away, his smirk gone. The high-ranking official, so quick to dismiss, shifted in his seat but said nothing. The robotic steward hesitated, as if recalculating its response. It had followed its programming, followed the unspoken rules enforced by those around it. But now, something had changed. A shift in the atmosphere, a shift in perception. Then, without hesitation, the elderly man gestured to his own seat. The soldier met his gaze, and for the first time in a long while, he saw something in another's eyes that he had almost forgotten: acknowledgement. Before he could speak, another passenger stood, then another. One by one, seats were offered, until nearly half the cabin had made space. The child watched, wide-eyed, as the moment unfolded. The question she had asked had changed everything. The soldier remained still for a moment longer, taking in the shift in the room, the weight of what had just occurred. The war had been fought on the battlefield, but this was a battle of its own, one fought not with weapons but with truth. The transport vessel drifted through space, a silent giant gliding across the void, its engines humming beneath the polished floors. Within the cabin, passengers sat in their designated seats, absorbed in quiet conversations or lost in their data pads. The air was thick with a false sense of peace, an illusion of civility that crumbled the moment the human soldier stepped through the entrance. His presence, though silent, disrupted the delicate balance that the passengers maintained so carefully. He carried himself with the disciplined posture of a man who had seen war, his uniform a quiet testament to battles fought and sacrifices made. His boots made no unnecessary noise against the floor as he moved down the aisle, scanning the rows of seats. There were empty spaces, seats occupied by bags, jackets, or the unspoken will of those who did not wish to share their space. He did not expect a warm welcome. He had lived through too many encounters like this to expect anything different. The robotic steward, positioned at the center of the cabin, remained still until he approached. Its polished exterior gleamed under the soft lighting as it processed his request. "All seats have been assigned," the steward stated. "No exceptions allowed." The words were neutral, without emotion, but they carried the weight of the collective decision of the passengers. They had already made up their minds before he had even stepped aboard. He was unwelcome, an inconvenience they preferred to ignore. The soldier's expression did not change. He had faced death without flinching. This moment, though insulting, did not shake him. Yet, it was not about the seat. It was about the silent rejection, the subtle dismissal that reinforced what he already knew. The war may have ended, but humanity's battle for acceptance had not. He turned his gaze to a coalition official seated near the front, his uniform crisp, his rank visible. If anyone had the authority to override the steward's directive, it was him. "Sir, I require a seat." The official did not bother looking up from his data pad. "Seats are assigned. You should have secured one beforehand." A wave of quiet amusement rippled through the cabin. A younger officer seated nearby smirked, shaking his head. "You people never learn," the officer muttered, just loud enough for the soldier to hear. "Always expecting special treatment." The insult was casual, effortless. The soldier's expression remained unreadable, his years of discipline keeping his emotions buried beneath a mask of indifference. He had faced worse than insults. He had survived far greater hostility. But the weight of the moment pressed down on him all the same. A child's voice broke the silence. "Why can't he sit?" It was a simple question, innocent in its delivery but sharp in its impact. Seated beside her mother, the girl looked around the room with wide, uncomprehending eyes. She did not see politics or unspoken prejudices. She saw an empty seat and a man who needed one. The mother shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the edge of her armrest. "It's complicated," she whispered, as if hoping the conversation would end there. "But why?" The child persisted, her gaze flicking between the passengers and the soldier. "There's space." A heavy silence settled over the cabin. The conversations that had once filled the space fell away. Eyes that had previously ignored the soldier now flickered toward him, then away just as quickly. The unspoken justification for their actions, so easy to maintain when left unquestioned, was suddenly laid bare by the innocence of a child. An elderly man, silent until now, let out a slow breath and stood. His movements were deliberate, his gaze scanning the room before settling on the coalition. "Official." His voice, though calm, carried a quiet authority. "This man fought for us," the old man said, his tone steady. "While we sat in safety, he stood against enemies who would have wiped us out. And now, we pretend he is not worth a seat." No one responded. The young officer who had mocked the soldier looked away, his confidence suddenly absent. The high-ranking official shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. The robotic steward, incapable of understanding the weight of the moment, hesitated, as if waiting for new input. The old man turned toward the soldier and, without hesitation, motioned toward his own seat. "Take mine." Before the soldier could respond, another passenger stood. Then another. One by one, people offered their places. The child watched, her small hands gripping the edge of her seat as she took in the shift in the room. The soldier's gaze swept across the passengers, reading their faces, noting the unspoken understanding that now lingered in the air. It was a moment that would not erase the past, but it was a step towards something different. The weight of exclusion, though not lifted entirely, felt just a little lighter. The transport vessel cruised silently through the vastness of space, its exterior gleaming under the distant starlight. Within the passenger cabin, the atmosphere was one of quiet chatter and idle distractions, a mix of dignitaries, merchants, and officials, each engrossed in their own affairs. The seats were plush, the lighting soft, the air filtered to perfection. It was a place of comfort, a place where the struggles of the universe seemed distant, as if war and suffering were nothing more than stories told in history books. And then the soldier stepped in. Dressed in a worn but neatly kept uniform, his presence was an immediate disruption to the carefully maintained tranquility. He was a symbol of something raw, something real, a reminder of battles fought and lives lost. The passengers noticed him, even if they pretended not to. His sharp gaze swept the cabin, assessing the seating arrangement, noting the empty spaces occupied not by people, but by bags, coats, or deliberate postures meant to discourage company. He approached the robotic steward stationed near the entrance, its polished metal form a stark contrast to his own rugged appearance. It stood motionless until he stepped closer, its sensors registering his presence before responding in a cold, mechanical voice. "All seats have been assigned," the steward stated. "No exceptions allowed." The words echoed through the cabin, reinforcing the quiet message already conveyed by the passengers. He was unwelcome here. The soldier remained silent, his expression unreadable. He had fought battles where silence meant survival, where hesitation could be the difference between life and death. A denied seat was a small thing compared to what he had endured, but it was not about the seat. It was about what it represented. His gaze moved to a coalition official seated near the front, a man whose uniform bore insignias of diplomatic rank. If anyone had the authority to intervene, it was him. "Sir, I require a seat," the soldier said, his voice steady. The official barely lifted his gaze from his data pad. "Seats are assigned. If you failed to make arrangements, that is your own problem." Dismissed. Just like that. A quiet chuckle from a nearby passenger carried through the room. A younger officer, dressed in the crisp uniform of the coalition peacekeeping force, smirked as he leaned back in his seat. "Maybe next time, plan ahead," the young officer said, amusement laced in his voice. "Or do your kind not think that far ahead?" The words were intended to provoke, to elicit a reaction. But the soldier had faced worse than insults. He had stared into the eyes of enemies who sought to eradicate his people, had fought through storms of fire and steel where words meant nothing. He stood unmoved, his silence more powerful than any retort he could have given. The murmurs in the cabin grew, passengers whispering among themselves, their gazes flickering toward the soldier and then away again. No one spoke up. No one challenged what was happening. It was easier to ignore, easier to pretend that this was not their problem. Indifference had always been the simplest path. And then a small voice broke through the tension. "Why can't he sit?" A child, no older than 6, sat beside her mother, her white eyes filled with confusion. To her, the logic was simple. There were seats. The man needed one. Why was he not allowed to sit? The mother shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around her daughter's hand. "It's complicated," she said, attempting to dismiss the question. "But why?" The child pressed. "There's space." Silence fell over the cabin, heavier than before. The unspoken reasoning that had guided the passengers' decisions was now laid bare by the innocence of a child. There was no justification, no reasoning that could be explained in simple words. The passengers who had pretended not to notice were now forced to confront the reality of their actions. An elderly man near the back of the cabin stirred. He had remained quiet until now, observing with a knowing gaze. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, his voice carrying an air of quiet authority. "This man fought for us," he said, his tone steady. "While we debated policies and made speeches, he bled for our survival. And now, we refuse him a seat." His words struck like a hammer, shattering the comfortable illusion of normalcy that had filled the cabin. The young officer who had mocked the soldier looked away, his smirk fading. The high-ranking official, so quick to dismiss, shifted uneasily in his seat but said nothing. The robotic steward hesitated, its programming designed for efficiency but not for moments like this. It processed the words, as if recalculating the situation, yet remained motionless, awaiting new input. The old man turned to the soldier, his gaze filled with something that had become rare: respect. Without hesitation, he gestured to his own seat. "Take mine." Before the soldier could respond, another passenger stood. Then another. One by one, people offered their seats. A silent shift had occurred, an acknowledgement that had been long overdue. The child watched, her small hands gripping the edge of her seat as she absorbed the scene unfolding before her. The soldier remained still for a moment, taking in the change. He had fought battles on the battlefield, but this was something different. This was a battle fought not with weapons, but with truth. The war for humanity's place in the universe was not over, but in this moment, a step had been taken, a barrier had been broken. And though the past could not be undone, something new had begun to take shape in its place.